So welcome everyone to this episode of Event Insights. My name is Chrissy. I'm with Safe Events Global, and joining me today I have Brandon Slootweg and Travis Semmens. They are with Dynamic Crowd Measurements, and today they're going to be talking to us about dynamic crowd management. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, don't hesitate to pop them in the chat there. The guys here are more than happy to make it quite an interactive presentation. So you can chat away. Otherwise, obviously, we can still do a Q&A at the end. And I know a few people had mentioned to me earlier in the week that they might have to jump off a few minutes early because of meetings. So no worries. As usual, we will be recording this, so you'll be able to catch up on the last few minutes on Friday on our YouTube. So in the meantime, gentlemen, I'll hand it over to you guys.
Perfect. Thanks, Chrissy. I'm looking at the presentation. Is that something on our end we start or?
Yeah, Brandon, you go ahead and you can do your screen share from there.
Okay, because I think it added here. Perfect. Well, hi, thanks everyone. Thank you, of course, Safe Events for having us. Events Sites webinar series is often very interesting, and we hope to bring you a lot of value. I'm together with my business partner and co-founder, Travis, in the room. So we'll do just some quick introductions and then take it from there. Trev, do you want to go ahead in terms of what your background is and how long you've been in the events industry and what we're currently working at?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everyone, and thank you for your time. So I've been fortunate enough to be in the industry for 27 years, and I've been to all the major hallmark events that we call them here in Australia, which is all of our large gatherings that across Australia. So for the last 27 years working on event, crowd management, risk management, emergency management, the planning, working with stakeholders and government agencies on all the major events, and then all events within venues that travel around Australia as well. And I'm fortunate enough to run an organisation that mans those events. So we supply staff and the planning for those events as well. That's sort of just a little summary.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks for sharing that, of course. Look, my background is in events as well. I've started about 10 years ago, and around 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to work with everyone also in Australia. Been doing from event production, grew into crowd management, and for the past few years became very, very passionate about crowd management and how we do things in crowd management, and technology has become a big, big part of that. So I've been fortunate enough for the past few years to consult on several events in terms of crowd management, but also to deploy our technology at these events. And that's what we're going to discuss and talk about today. So I think, let's get started. Because a few years ago, of course, Travis, back in the years when we started out these big events, what was your experience then from the traditional side of crowd management to where it is now, and how you've come about using technology?
I think for me, I was touring with a large international band, and large crowds were coming, and it was quite scary at that point of time how we treated events and crowds when they attended our venues or events. And so I was concerned in how we actually went about planning for events. And I thought we needed to step ahead of time and work out another way to manage a crowd safely, or even look at when a person becomes a crowd or when a crowd needs to be managed. It was really important to understand when we need to implement change, and I wasn't happy with the current way we were planning events. The written wasn't enough for me at that point in time. No two crowds are the same. The venue or the type, the performer's always different. The weather, the impact, all those factors, sort of shaped different way of looking at it. And so that's why we started to look at a three-dimensional way and looking at crowds and how we manage them. That's what sort of developed with the technology and bringing that into the current methodology that we use now in crowd management.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think definitely the complexity of crowds is an important part. We're all very familiar with all the work Keith Still, for instance, has done and many others in terms of the work on crowds. It's showing the complexity and how environmental and external factors can influence those crowds. And I think what hit me very well is that even with that knowledge and a lot of experience and all the traditional plans that are still relevant, of course, but it's all comes down to a lot of gut feel. So based on the experience that the crowd manager nowadays has throughout those years, they've sort of themselves started to identify certain situations and then could act accordingly on them. And I think that's very hard to teach. Even when I started out doing the course and learned more about crowd management, the way when you dive deeper into it and go more towards the science and complexity of these crowds, the amount of external factors that could influence a crowd or crowd behavior are so massive. And even planning for that by having the target audience, your risk assessments up front, crowds can still turn up differently through the day. I think we had a very good example of Sydney New Year's Eve a couple of years ago, when we planned for the crowds to ingress at certain times. The next year can be completely different. So that was definitely an eye-opener.
I think it's also sort of important that our approach isn't about replacing the skill and intuition of experienced staff that are on the ground. I think that's well acknowledged. It's still essential, but it's about supporting the experience with better tools and real-time information. So we can make those decisions, make sure they're sharper and more in a timely fashion. And I think that's the focus that we've started to look at, that can support the planning that has always been there. So we can't forget about it. It's really, really important. But a lot of it was done on gut feeling. It was, as you said before, the gut feeling and the plans were written. They're important, but they only take us so far. And once the event starts, we need to start to look at it in a little bit of a different way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think touching on that in terms of traditional crowd management and where the planning phase, often in the lead up to the event, we try to do as much as we can to sort of plan for the situations we think could arise from a theoretical perspective, how many people can fit in a space, can pass through a space. And I think in the operation, it often comes down to what time. We just discussed timing of crowds arriving, but when they're there, are they acting and moving through the space as planned, or do we need to intervene at certain points? And yes, of course, with the scenario planning and contingency planning and activating flippers, that all helps us from a preparation and planning perspective. But on the night, we all know it's getting very busy, sometimes a little bit hectic in the control room when all things start to happen at once, especially for the bigger events. And then it often comes down to the experience from the people on the ground, or the screens and camera feeds available that allows us to sort of see what's happening. And I think on that point, definitely relying on camera footage and doing estimates from there. Science already backed it up that that's really, really hard to estimate correctly. And I've seen many examples, often even when deployed technology, that they often the first response is the technology's off, it's wrong, it's not putting the right figures. And actually we then see how unreliable sometimes manual observations can be because of distortion of the camera view. It's so hard to estimate. And that's definitely one of the interesting parts I think I've come to learn when it comes to manual observations and relying on these things. Also from people on the ground. It could be busy in one section of the event site, and if you do your observation there, from the point on the ground, it might look very busy, but further up the street, it could be much less busy. So the overall picture there becomes really important.
Yeah, I think it's important to, that history shows us that events, even with the best planning, can go wrong. and we need to be able to identify quickly when those changes occur. And that's sort of where we link into this part of the crowd management. Is the key challenge is speed, and technology gives us the ability to make those decisions. As you were saying before, when we're using a person for a long period of time, you've got to think about an event goes for a long period of time, and they can get, they're sitting there in front of those screens for a long time. They get fatigued. There's a lot of noise in the room. So it's really, really hard to have them concentrate on those exact things that are going to happen. And we need to be able to start to identify and how to find that problem early, and then how we act on it. And then that comes down to the speed. And I think that's where the technology is helping us identify that, bring it to our attention, so then we can still make it happen quite quickly.
Absolutely. I think definitely in the past few years, planning and preparation has risen to a very good level. I think industry standards have risen and regulation has catched up with that for the most part. Unfortunately, we all know some tragedies still happen. And I think a few recent examples from Itaewon or even the Travis Scott, which are very close examples, it still does occur. And the question would be, even with all this good planning, resourcing, staffing on the ground, how can we get more tools at our disposal to ensure that we do the best we can to make sure these incidents do not happen? I think it's a good point now to look at all the challenges we're facing currently. Definitely events get more complex. The situation where the locations where they're held, even if it's public, non-ticketed events, cities are getting complex by itself already, let alone then putting an event in of several thousand people has a large impact. Even with growing events, public events are getting more popular. So with many people rising to that, higher safety standards. Good thing that the industry standards are going to a next level and progressing. But it also means the planning needs to be up to speed, and then the execution during the operations phase. What on your end do you see in terms of events where you're working on, where you see that complexity increase, and how do you respond to that from a challenging point perspective, from a traditional point of view?
Yeah, I think we need to look at the frameworks and how we can adapt in real time. Guided by live information, so we're not always reacting after the fact. I think that's been a real big part of the industry, how we've planned, and we need to adjust those frameworks to take into account the technology and how we actually move to critical, sort of decisions, or when we have to implement change, which is, the alternative routes or the messaging framework, or the different wayfinders, all the different triggers and the controls that we can have. So I think it comes down to basically the framework and how we can adapt it in real time, to summarize that section.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's sometimes the tiny things, in an event, a delay at the gate, a sudden rain shower, and then you link back to the New Year's Eve ones where, I've been fortunate enough to do it for like the last 25 years. And incredibly, it's in the same footprint and it changes every single year. Just from a little bit hotter in the daytime, they arrive earlier, or there was, the dust storm, or the weather was terrible. It just changed so many different dynamics. And by looking at that framework and adapting with the technology, we found it a lot easier to understand the crowd and when we had to make those decisions.
Yeah, great. And I think also we've displayed here on the points as well to touch on what social media has for an impact in terms of also event experience. I think, yes, we plan from a safety perspective, and it's always our first and foremost attention. But then secondly, of course, the visitor experience is as important, because everything is under stress from even economics and budget perspective. meaning that people on social media, you instantly see how people experience your event, whether they would come and visit your event again, or even the other downside would be once an event is popular and it's still going on and the word goes out on social media, you might have it in a crowd emerge and you have to deal with that all of a sudden. And I think with everything also it comes down to resources. So beside the planning that you have time to prepare for the event, it's in that moment that you have only a fixed amount of resources, and where do you deploy them? So one of the big challenges, of course, you have this much budget and staffing and resources available, and how can they be at your best disposal across the site? I think that is definitely one of the bigger challenges we face, and we could potentially address by using technology. So anything on a resource perspective that you use in your experience where technology can assist?
Yeah, definitely. Look, I've found over time, introducing the technology has allowed for more proactive measurements within the crowd and where we're placing crowd managers and security staff and different infrastructure. So by sort of implementing that into the framework, it's allowed us to actually reduce a little bit of manpower in certain areas, which has helped with obviously budgets and restraints that we have in all events. Obviously, that's the forefront of everything is a budget. Sometimes, in the past there has been a lot of deployment and they're not in the right areas, or you're not using them to the best of their capability or their ability. So with the technologies, we've been able to reduce that a little bit in certain areas, and then focus on the proactive work, attending the areas that have been identified where there's been a change in the density or the flow or the mood of the crowd. So yeah, we found that to be really exciting and a big improvement.
Yeah, and I think that is definitely a good point to touch on now, what is actually possible today, because technology has come a long way. I think it has advanced in the past few years quite significantly. Yes, from our perspective and from DCM's perspective, where we use computer vision, so a camera-based algorithm that identifies how busy to look at the density, the mood, and the flow within a crowd. And there's so much other technology that can support as well, from radio waves to radar, Wi-Fi picking up signals, counting solutions. So all these technology is available to us to help assist the crowd manager in this tool set to have a safe and influence the visitor experience. And I think from our perspective, definitely from DCM's perspective, which we have the unique capability for to objectively measure the mood, and therefore can say and tell something about the experience, that is a game changer in this case, because there are situations where we can intervene based on actually seeing a drop in mood or the actual experience of the event, by then allocating those resources that will be at our disposal to, for instance, activate such a flipper from our contingency planning, or put messaging up screen, so it's all coming together and work together.
Yeah, I think the answer to me is real-time monitoring. If you ask that sort of question around crowd management, what's the answer? It's real-time monitoring. It allows us to give clear decision, or it allows you to make clear decision making. It gives you an instant view of what's happening at that particular time. It gives you an understanding of where the pressure point is forming. It's so many times you can walk into a control room, or you can be out in the field, you come across a pinch point or an area that has crowd congestion, or the crowd is deteriorating, and the experienced security guard can still be standing there watching it and thinking that it's all okay. He's on the ground level. Immediately in front of him, it looks fine, but from another view that's actually looking at it, processing that data and giving you a real insight how the crowd's moving, how the density's building, or if the flow is too high. The answer is real-time monitoring for me, and working into the methodology of crowd management is definitely the way to go forward. I found it very useful with the dashboards. I mean, I'm aging now, so I'm getting quite old. I can't run around the event site. So some of the larger events where we're across a whole city, you just can't be in all those areas at once. So it's really important to be able to have that live dashboard to be able to give us the best, sort of information to make the correct decision, that we can hand down to our, the GCC or the CCC or wherever the event command in or which country you're in, whatever you relate to it.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point. And I think definitely real-time monitoring, I've experienced myself on a few events as well. Very, very essential in terms of the live operations of the event, but also definitely to touch on the retrospective aspect of this in terms of the information that's available after the event. Because oftentimes in evaluations or when people come together, the general feel in the room would be discussed in terms of, I felt it was busy in this area. And then there's a few things around that. What is defined as busy and how do we define busy? And what information, evidence-based information do we have to support that? So before we dive into the few examples that we have, it's definitely increasing our situational awareness. We have an early detection of the risks that are emerging on site. So definitely in the pre-planning phase, we of course try to address all the risks in terms of crowds that we can expect, but then being able to early identify those and to respond and act accordingly, and also within the organization then deploy the right resources to that and make the decision from a control room, which you just mentioned, whether that's an ECC or GCC. But definitely because the events are getting bigger, the command and control structure is getting bigger as well. So everyone looking at that same thing and have that same shared situational awareness, for me, that is a key takeaway in terms of the dashboards and having that up to sort of all look at the same operational picture and then start the conversation from there.
Yeah, I think looking at the same live picture is really, really important. It's good evidence-based. It gives us a really solid benchmark for everyone to start looking at it and understanding what the change are. Because in the past, when you think about a large crowd comes, there's a lot of guesswork that's been involved in crowd management over the years. And if we're all working off one platform in the ECC, we have a live picture, there's appropriate data, and we're making the decisions on that data, it's a great start.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we dive into the rest of the actual case studies, I think it's nice to just do a little bit of a recap from why we think it matters that you use technology to support in your events operation. And I think definitely one of the key takeaways for me is that these early warnings and these early messages, whether that's alerts, whether that's a real-time dashboard you can see the crowd build up in, or whether it's a situation that emerges with the actual measurements and being able in the dashboard, in our case, that would be the case, to align that based on risk levels. So you can keep an eye on the highest risk level that you're comfortable with before you need to act on that situation. That is definitely one of the key possibilities. I think now we can use technology. And one of the key takeaways, I think, is also that knowing what to do and when. Because often in these plans, in the lead up to the event, when we design these plans, it is in there. And I think a good example and a great example for someone here told me that he used congestion mapping to estimate when it was going to be busy on his event site, which is very helpful from a planning perspective. And he sort of aligned his resources up to that. But then on the day itself, it was really hard to tell whether that pre-planned congestion mapping was accurate and if he did need to respond accordingly towards that instead of, so the framework was right, but then it needed to be applied, but he needed the information, what was happening on the site, so it could tell him when he needed to actually intervene. And
I think it's important to understand the dynamics accurately. If we understand that, we improve both safety and visitor experience at all events. And to do that, we need those early warning signs. It's precious to have extra time when we're making those big decisions. I mean, seconds, minutes, they can prevent an incident. So we've just got to make sure that we understand that and we have that in front of us to make the best decision. It goes from reactive controls, which we've been doing. We can move to the proactive controls, and that can be by the data that we see on the screens. And if it's live, it puts us in a really good position.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope it will change the way we think about crowds, because we get so much more insights and can validate those insights of some assumptions or ways we think it's always been done in a certain way, which helps or has a certain effect or response to it. And I hope technology opens up, and I think it does, towards to change that thinking and see how much of a support it can be in the event operations. So I think now would be a great time to dive a bit more into the actual deployments that we've done so far. In this case, with DCM, so Notting Hill Carnival is one of the events we've also recently worked on. For the past few years, we've been very lucky and happy to be involved in their crowd monitoring. This year was for the first time we expanded across the footprint a bit further than sound systems that we were previously monitoring. So we were monitoring the parade route, which was very, very helpful information, because this is a very complex event with a lot of in and egress, different egress points. People coming from Notting Hill Gate Station, coming from the south to walking towards the north, coming from other stations around Paddington Station is a big station that's also very heavily communicated by the transport company to utilize that station. Just a complex side with many things happening at the same time. So the parade route has 90 to 100 floats with people following them from large to smaller groups. But some of these groups can have a couple thousand people behind them following that float and celebrating up and towards the middle section of the whole event, where there's lots of sound systems, where people can enjoy different styles of music. It's all community-based, so a lot of involvement from the local community, but also people flying in from all over the world to experience the event. And then there's a lot of food stalls, and you really, the circulation around the site is definitely complex. So having this with many authorities, multiple stakeholders, having that shared situational awareness, in this case in the CMC, what's called the crowd monitoring cell, is such an asset, because this is the first time that we can identify and estimate what the actual crowd densities are, and then having an objective view from how busy it is at that point, where there's still space, where we need to draw our attention to, what the capacities are at certain sound systems, and it increases the whole situational awareness across multiple stakeholders in this case. Also, it triggers, and that of course comes down back to the planning, but responses and when to respond, that came actually quite well. So if we had a certain density threshold that was then reached, we could also deploy a certain message to relieve crowd pressure, or at least inform the crowds and try to enforce that, have that behavior and have the informants to the crowd to ensure we can support that free flow crowd movements across this site. So this is a very good real life example. So by the way, any questions regarding these certain use cases, feel free to drop them in now, or at least at the end during the Q&A. DEFCON 1, one of the leading world's hardstyle festivals, attracting many, many visitors. Very interesting assignment here, where we have, as you see in the background, the main stage of DEFCON. DEFCON has, by the way, a very, very data-driven approach. So the organizers and event production crew at DEF CON are really into data, so they have all sorts of data sources available. So this is a great project for us, where we can also look at other data and see what more influence the crowds, from temperature to humidity, the sound levels, all these data we are looking at it. But the main safety perspective is to measure the crowd density at the red stage, because at some point in time, especially on the opening and closing ceremonies, but also at their power hour, which is on Saturday afternoon, their main attraction, definitely everyone travels from the rest of the event side towards here. And there's a maximum capacity, and also we're trying to understand how is the dispersion of the crowds across the side. What does the density look like at the front or at the back? Is it the distribution? How's the distribution? And also at other sites, which is quite interesting, we provide capacity counts. So even with limited cameras that we deploy, we can still estimate how many people are in a tent. So basically from your control center, which is large at DEF CON, they work with multiple companies to get all these data streams to this massive control center. But they have their shared situational awareness across all the crowd managers on site, looking at the densities, looking at the capacities, and then again implement their contingency plans accordingly based on the data. So that's a very exciting and interesting project. Yeah, this one we both know. Laneway, very popular festival in Australia, where we integrated with their crowd management plan. I think you've have been there with Fred again as well, Travis?
Yes, yeah, and other Fred again festivals as well, which is really, really interesting, and especially for this one is that it's very difficult to manage a crowd in a concert when there's several stages. Yes, the organisers do a wonderful job of planning and go through that process to have, clash finders and make sure the stages are playing the correct bands to draw the crowd. But as we've all learned over the years, even the best planning can sometimes not work. So what we found in this instance was the main area, obviously couldn't hold the entire crowd. And we need to identify that if the plan didn't go to the way that, it had been organised to run to. So it was very important to look at key areas, trigger points, and then understand the other areas. And that's what I've found in crowd management quite difficult too, because when you're dealing with staff on the ground, a little bit of CCTV coverage, you're trying to gather that information at a particular time. So that actually takes time to get on the radio, call the area, get an update, understand other areas, send a response team in. And that's that trigger that Brandon was talking about in the other two events. It's really important to be able to have that information firsthand within an instant and in several areas. Then you can make that decision. And that's what we found in the last three of these, the ones that Brandon just spoke about, is exactly what we need to move to make that correct decision at the right time. And for everyone else to look at it too at the same time, and we all collectively come together to make that decision. I think that's been the important part. For this particular one, we got to show the data on the stage. So, the people who are in charge of the stages got to see and understand the data to make decisions at the right time. There's been many shows that I've learnt from terrible mistakes that I've done, where you might have stopped a show because you thought it was at a level that it should be stopped, and it created a few more problems. By looking at it and understanding those densities at a higher level, it can, lead us into better decisions. But it also allows you to implement change and then actually see the change when it's occurring. And that's a really hard thing to do when you're not monitoring it through technology. Is you could change something and then you ask for the field staff to report back, and they're not capturing what they need to capture because they're not in that location. Whereas the pre-planning's been done, we have the technology there, and as soon as you make a change, you will see a correction in the data, and you're on the right path because you've only got a couple of seconds to do this. And that's where we found in some of these triggers that this was working in these shows.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, another example of where we recently deployed is Roskilde Festival. I think very well known to many of you. I think this picture is also great on the right side. There's one of their bigger areas in between the barriers where they definitely are keen to monitor the crowd buildup and the flow, because during the ingress and the crowd buildup, how more condensed the crowd gets, of course, the more people will flow into that space and keep flowing into that space until you might get to a point that there's an unwanted or undesired high pressure. But in this case, with multiple cameras, we could monitor that, and it's so interesting because Roskilde is definitely very advanced in terms of their crowd planning and all the risk levels they determine. So DCM in this case integrated fully with their system that they had implemented, and then could display that in the same values that they are used to working in. So that all made sure there was one common language that everyone still communicates in once it reaches a certain level of density. And secondly, apart from the stages monitoring that we did at the orange stage, there were also other areas that they had side design changes due to earlier instances where there was crowd flow concerns and crowd buildup that needed to be in different areas because of campsite entrances. In this way, it allowed also for measuring continuously when it was busy there, how actually the site layout changed, supported that what they were achieving. So it's pretty exciting to see how these projects unfold. I think one last real world example case is Vivid. I think one of the biggest so far we're involved in is definitely as a deployment with over 120 cameras on site. Travis, you've been involved in the planning from the early days for Vivid, so happy to have you share about how you implemented the crowd management planning and then moved into supporting with technology from the start.
Yeah, this has been an interesting one. It's sort of been, over 16 years of development, and up to a bit over 3 million people come over 23 nights, for a 5-hour section of the night period. There's unlimited amount of people can attend. There's no tickets, there's no fencing. And it's sort of now grown to, sort of like an 8-kilometre walk of lights and interaction and installations through the entire city. No city was ever built for an event. I haven't found anyone or anywhere in the world where a city is actually purpose-built for an event. So the reason for the large deployment is if you make a decision in a certain area, it's going to affect another area. And it's impossible for each area to understand, or the workers in each of those areas to understand the sort of effects that's going to occur to another area. So we've found over the years of development and understanding the footprint is deploying a number of cameras, in this case, well over 100, helped us make those decisions at the right time, and really look at the mood of the crowd. So if we can keep that at a neutral level, and it's a transitioning crowd, we know that they're going to stand in front of installations for a certain part of time, which is a dwell time, and we only have a specific area. So if we start to see the change in that area, we need to hit the alternative routes. And as we've listed on the screen is the flippers. There's a couple of hundred active flippers that get activated during the night. That is a normal part of our crowd management sort of methodology and controls with the crowd. It goes down to, trying to understand how many people come across an entire city is quite a difficult feat. But in this case, as Brandon said, with DEFCON and other areas, by using the technology, we can come up with a very, very close, accurate count of how many people are in the area in real time, which is really important to stakeholders and definitely the police, who have the overarching call and emergency, planning for this. If something goes wrong, they definitely need to know how many accurate numbers. It's hard in these instances. If it's an event that's ticketed, it's very simple. You run your ticket through your door and you can say how many people you've got on site. Where those people accumulate on site is another problem, and that's why this is really important to involve the technology into it. And since we've been doing that, I've found the last sort of 5 to 6 years, which have been the most challenging years because of the high attendance of crowd, has actually been really comfortable in the crowd management side of things for us, and future planning as well has helped us look at the data and have a look at, when the crowds are actually arriving. Not what we thought, really look at the data to make that correct decision. So it's definitely helped us along that time.
Yeah, no, exciting projects, and definitely the ones of these sizes, but also any size, but definitely in this one. And also, again, lots of stakeholders involved, the integration with other dashboards and providing that data across a multi-agency level. Definitely very interesting and helpful. All right, I think that were the real life. Of course, there are a few more, but I think these were the ones that we definitely wanted to highlight because of their environment, whether that's festivals, city environments, ticketed, non-ticketed, all these aspects come in here. So where do we see this going next? I think definitely more predictive analytics and forecasting. So based on the technology that you deploy, then for next year, the times it was getting busy last year. So the models are able to predict what you could expect this year, but also from multiple years. If you see that stacked up, that predictive element becomes better and better, while the machine is learning more and more. And that brings us from a reactive point of view, where we see crowd emergent behavior emerging at any single point in time, to have a more proactive response and also improve our planning efforts before the event starts. And hopefully that will lead to some more new standards and also trust. I think the trust in technology, that's something I still feel needs to grow. I think we're very used to it. We're also very used to deploying it and using it in our operations. But I do see within the industry, there's still a bit of it's still a bit divided whether to trust the data upon what it's saying. And it sounds easy, but once you're up against it and you need to make a decision based on it, it definitely, in some occasions, we've seen people fall back to their intuition or things they've done in a certain way for many years. But the data is there, and once it's all configured well and good, then you can work from there.
I think it's important too, Brandon, that the planning stage is so important. So that's like the bare bones of it. It's the blueprint of every single event, and if we can improve that by supplying, analyze patterns, we can have a look at the behavior, we can have a look at historical data, and then we can forecast crowd movements and potential risks. And they're the key factors in every sort of crowd management plan that you want to include. So if we can support that as one of the layers with adopting the technology, then we're heading in the right direction. Everyone wants to go to an event, have a good time and go home. I think what we've got to plan for is that if they arrive happy, we want them to leave even happier. And that's one of those KPIs that we try to set on a crowd, is that you don't just want them to come and get through the event. We want them to leave even happier. And we can have a look at that on the system because we're collecting the mood, and we can do those changes and adjust certain things to try to make the crowd in a neutral or happy, departure.
Yeah, and absolutely. And before, because many people might wonder, where's that mood element indeed coming from? But that's why we think it's definitely so important from a KPI standpoint. Definitely, you're right, in terms of how do people come to an event, how do they leave, and do they leave happier than they came? Means they have a good experience. But also in the operational side of things, touching back on those stage monitoring examples. This is an example where you actually see a crowd, and we often in our planning phase, whether we do the green guide or have other methods of assessing the appropriate density for a stage area. In this case, we could definitely see that the increase in density, which was in the previous concerts around 4.5, now leading up to 5.5 at 15, we actually saw a more negative mood all around, which that held on because it always bounces up and down a bit because that what happens, and that's also how we collect the data. But to have it in a continuous way in a negative mood, that indicated something was going on. And this is a great example that in the control room at the same time, we got word from the medicals that more people were carried over the barrier and felt uncomfortable. And in this case, the artist also had to pause or stop the show 2 times before resumed it again to calm down the crowd a bit. So this is a real life example also how mood can support us in that operational phase. And also, even if the planning says 4 to 5 people per square meter as a maximum, people at 6 people per square meter, if that allows for the physical conditions, of course, could be still in a positive mood, and then there would be less risk because they're positive. So the intervention might be different based on the circumstances, of course.
Yeah, and I think the intervention is really important factor of that is that, as you said, if you can adjust it a little bit, and as you're watching that and the data's producing that dashboard, you can make tiny little adjustments so the crowd actually enjoy it. Because once they tip over that factor and they become in a really negative area and the density is too high, it's a show stop. No one wants to go to a show stop. A show pause on multiple occasions is a lot better show than a show stop. So knowing those exact triggers to do that in a set is really important, and that's where we've found where this data has helped us a great deal.
I think we're about to wrap up what we've seen so far. I hope it has been very insightful. I think we're very exciting that the new technology and the technology we set out in the field of crowd management, where we are able to measure the density, the flow and mood, and also capacity, offers a completely new perspective on how we operationally can deal with crowd management and support the crowd managers on the ground with all the real-time insights, the safety, the experience that we've been talking about, improving those. I think it's a new era, and I hope a lot of the industry will embrace and adopt the data-driven decision-making in the future.
Yeah, and I think summarizing it, we're moving into a world where crowd management is guided by evidence, not just instinct. So it's really important that, we move with these times, because to be a crowd manager now is a lot harder than it was 20 years ago. It's really something that we have to implement and adapt with.
Absolutely. Look, I think we're at the point that if there's some questions to be asked, then we're happy to take the questions. I think to finalize, and we hope to have shared some insights that inspire a few people, and feel free to reach out. And also happy on the behalf of Safe Events, of course, thank you again for allowing us to do this webinar. And if it's a lot of information, and I could assume that there may be some more questions how things in the nitty-gritty work well. That's maybe for another time, but also feel free to reach out for us. Everyone who's seen this webinar, if you reach out on the basis of this webinar, we're happy to do a live session with you and look at your event, how this would work for you.
Guys, thank you very much. That was really, really insightful. As I said, attendees, if there are any questions, feel free to throw them in. While people are thinking of that, I was just curious. I mean, obviously, density and flow, I can totally understand how the data can pick that up, but how exactly does it observe mood? Because obviously, that's a more difficult thing to gauge from a technological aspect.
Absolutely. I'm happy to take the question, and Travis can fill in where appropriate. And then the way we work in the computer vision model is that we use our algorithm to de-identify the image, look at the image and analyze, actually in this case for specifically the mood, we detect the facial characterization. So that means that we look basically at smiles and frowns in a literal way. So what we would do as humans as well, the data is the technology is able to interpret it in a privacy protected way.
Wow, that's really interesting. I see we have a question here from Danielle. Very interesting presentation. Out of curiosity, what was the total capacity of the DEF CON event? When I saw that picture of the red stage there, I was actually wondering the same thing. It's huge.
Yeah, I think it's 60,000 plus in their plans. I think they have the right the actual capacity. So yeah, I think it's definitely it's over 65,000 visitors a day there even. So
wow, from that one picture alone, I would have expected more. In fairness,
it's interesting. That's where we discussed the way that perceiving how busy it is in a crowd from a certain perspective can be very challenging, and definitely on away from CCTV cameras, that's a whole different ballgame. Why that could be interesting, but yeah, no, definitely it's a lot of people, and all the process in place and how they do that and monitor and manage that is definitely impressive.
Absolutely. Another impressive thing, Travis, in particular, that Vivid event in Sydney, I'd say that was massively challenging, considering you don't know how many people are going to turn up on the day, and you're going through the whole, as you said, there's no city purposely built for an event.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one because you have water on one side, and you have well, actually, down there's 27 entry points, there's 5 stations, there's foot traffic, there's transport hubs, and the thing around the government is that every city around the world builds transport to move people.
Yeah.
So you can't turn that off, and people will keep on arriving. And it's sold as a free event, and come to a magnificent event. So those are the challenges: is how do you manage a whole heap of people that keep on coming for a short period of time, over many nights, and it's up in the millions. It's a long 23 nights. It's very interesting. And as we said at the first stage there, I mean, Brandon's been working on it for a very long time with me, and every year we strip it back to the basics, and we have to restart the planning. We look at the data from the previous year, and it doesn't get old. We don't, even though we've been doing it for a long time. I think it's really important that we respect the crowd and when they come and how they arrive, and we look at it each year from a blank sheet. Absolutely. And look at everything that we've learned to build the next plan for the next year. So it's really, it's the same place, but it changes every single year.
I'd say so. It looks like a stunning event as well.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And I think there's lots of wonderful events around the world, and we've been fortunate enough to work on some and try to improve this side of what we do for a living. And that was one of the main things around sort of designing and building the dynamics of crowd measurement, and try to understand it in a 3-dimensional way.
Absolutely, because as we all know, the most important thing is for the crowds to come, enjoy the event, and go home safe and happy.
Yeah, that's a perfect event.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't see any more questions coming through here. Obviously, everyone watching, if you do think of any, feel free to reach out, and I can put you in touch with the guys here. But in the meantime, thank you both so much. Travis, I hope you have a good evening, and Brandon, yes. I hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Chrissy.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank
you all.
Guys, bye now.
Bye. Bye.